Iran is no longer just a country in the news. It has become the center of something far bigger than a regional conflict. Missiles, targeted strikes, covert operations, shifting alliances, all happening in real time, involving Israel, the United States, and multiple forces operating across the same region. But what makes this different is not just what is happening, it's how familiar it looks when placed next to something much older. Because long before modern governments, long before nuclear programs, long before intelligence agencies and global politics, the Bible already recorded a nation in that same region under a different name, Persia. And Persia is not mentioned casually. It appears at moments where history shifts, when empires fall, when Israel is under pressure, when decisions are made that change the direction of nations. It shows up when something bigger is happening. In one part of the Bible, Persia is used to break the power of Babylon, the strongest empire of its time, not through chaos, but through precision, a takeover so controlled it looked almost planned in advance. In another moment, Persia becomes the power that allows Israel to return home and rebuild what had been destroyed. It funds the reconstruction. It protects the process. It becomes, unexpectedly, a force of restoration. Then, centuries later, people from the East, widely believed to be connected to that same Persian system, are the first to recognize the birth of Jesus, while others remain unaware. And then, the story changes again. In one of the most serious prophetic passages in the Bible, Persia is listed among a group of nations that will rise in a future conflict involving Israel, not symbolically, not hidden, named directly, which creates a tension that has never fully been explained. How does the same nation move from being used to restore Israel to being named among those that will come against it? And more importantly, what happens when that same region once again becomes active in real-world conflict involving Israel, with alliances forming, operations expanding, and pressure increasing across multiple fronts? This is not about forcing prophecy into current events. It's about asking a more precise question. If Persia has always appeared at critical moments in history, what kind of moment are we entering now? Because the Bible does not just record what happened, it also describes patterns, and sometimes those patterns become visible again when history starts to move in a similar direction. So to understand what may be ahead, we have to go back, not to guess, but to trace the story carefully, from Persia's rise to its role in shaping history, to the alliances forming today, and the questions that are now becoming harder to ignore. Persia did not rise the way empires usually do. It did not dominate the world through long, chaotic wars. It did not slowly climb into power over generations. By the time Persia appeared at the center of history, everything it needed was already in place. And that is the part most people never stop to examine. Because while Babylon was expanding, conquering, and presenting itself as unstoppable, something else was happening in the background. Babylon was becoming vulnerable, not visibly, not publicly, but internally. Overconfidence, political instability, a leadership that believed its position could not be challenged. The kind of conditions that don't destroy an empire immediately, but prepare it to fall. And Persia did not rush into that moment. It waited, which already tells you something important. This was not reaction, it was timing. Now here is where the story moves beyond normal history. Because according to the Bible, Persia's rise was not just observed after it happened, it was written before it happened. In the book of Isaiah, a name appears long before the empire becomes visible. Cyrus, a future king, a future conqueror, a man who would defeat Babylon and shift the balance of power. And this was recorded more than 100 years before Cyrus was born. Not described vaguely, not hinted at, named. Which means before Persia became a global force, its most important leader was already identified. And when Cyrus finally appears in history, his actions follow that exact path, but not in the way people expect. Because the fall of Babylon was not a war, it was an operation. The city was considered impossible to take. Its walls were massive, its defenses were layered, its leadership felt secure. And yet, it fell in a single night. Not because its walls were broken, but because its system was understood. The Euphrates River flowed through Babylon, under its gates, into the heart of the city. That was the weakness, and Persia used it. The water level was reduced, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for soldiers to move through the riverbed, enough to bypass the defenses that no army had been able to break. No loud invasion, no destruction at the gates, no drawn-out battle. By the time Babylon realized something was wrong, Persian forces were already inside. And in that same moment, inside the palace, something else was happening. A message appeared, not from a general, not from a messenger, written on the wall. A declaration that the kingdom had been measured, weighed, and finished. And while those words were still being understood, power had already shifted. Babylon did not collapse slowly. It was replaced instantly. And Persia did not fight its way up. It stepped into position. This is where the deeper pattern becomes clear. Because this was not just military intelligence. It was alignment. Cyrus rises at the exact time Babylon weakens. He takes the city using a method that bypasses its strength. And he fulfills what had already been written long before he existed. That is not random. That is positioning. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because this is not how most power transitions happen. This is controlled, precise, timed. And this is where the connection to today becomes impossible to ignore. Because modern power does not always move through visible force anymore. It studies systems. It identifies weaknesses. It positions quietly. It waits for the right moment. And when that moment comes, it doesn't break the system. It moves through it. So the question is no longer just about Babylon. It becomes this. If one of the greatest empires in history fell, not through force, but through perfectly timed positioning, then how many systems today look strong but are already being studied from the outside? And how many shifts we are watching right now are not sudden events, but the result of something that has been quietly prepared for years? Because if Persia did not rise by accident then, what we are seeing today may not be random either. After Babylon falls, something happens that completely breaks the pattern of empire behavior. Persia does not tighten control. It releases it. Cyrus, now in power, makes a decision that no dominant empire had made before him. He allows the Jewish captives to return to Jerusalem. He authorizes the rebuilding of their temple. And more than that, he supports it. Resources are provided. Protection is granted. The process is not resisted. On the surface, this looks like mercy, a powerful ruler showing kindness to a displaced people. But history rarely works that way. Empires do not rise through emotion. They operate through calculation, which means this decision deserves a deeper look. Because freeing Israel was not just a spiritual event, it was a geopolitical move. At that time, the region surrounding Jerusalem was not empty. It was contested. Different groups, different interests, different loyalties, all competing for influence in a strategically important location between major powers. By allowing the Jews to return and rebuild, Persia was not just restoring a people, it was stabilizing a region. A rebuilt Jerusalem meant a functioning center. A loyal population meant reduced resistance. A restored identity meant a buffer between larger forces. In simple terms, Persia created order where there had been disruption. And that kind of move has long-term effects. Because once a people is restored to their land, their presence changes the balance of power permanently. And this is where the story becomes more layered. Because while Persia was making a calculated political move, the Bible describes something happening at the same time, not after, not separately, at the same time. The return of Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of worship. All of it aligns with what had already been spoken through prophecy, which creates a tension most people overlook. Was Persia acting out of strategy, or was it unknowingly fulfilling something already set in motion? Because from a political standpoint, the decision makes sense. From a prophetic standpoint, it was necessary. And both happened together. Which means Persia didn't just free Israel. It repositioned the entire region. Spiritually, politically, and historically. And that repositioning did not end in that moment. It carried forward. Because once Jerusalem was rebuilt, once the people returned, once the structure was restored, the region
became active again. Not quiet, not forgotten, active. And that activity continues all the way into the present. This is where the connection begins to sharpen, because modern conflicts in that same region are not happening on empty ground. They are happening on land that has already been fought over, rebuilt, claimed, and reclaimed. Decisions made thousands of years ago still shape the structure of the region today. And Persia was part of that foundation, not just as a conqueror, but as a restorer, which makes its later role even more complex. Because the same power that once helped stabilize the region is later described in prophecy as part of a future conflict involving that same land. So the question becomes unavoidable. Was Persia's decision to free Israel simply a moment of strategy? Or was it the beginning of a longer chain of events that continues to unfold across generations? Because if one decision can reshape a region for thousands of years, then what we are watching today may not be isolated events. It may be the continuation of something that started long before our time. And that changes how you look at everything that comes next.
After everything Persia did, defeating Babylon, releasing Israel, rebuilding a broken region, something unexpected happens. It fades. Not overnight, not dramatically, but gradually, almost quietly. And this is where most people stop paying attention. Because history moves on, a new force rises. Greece, fast, aggressive, unstoppable. Under Alexander, Persia doesn't slowly decline. It collapses. In a way that almost feels too fast for an empire that once controlled the known world. Which raises an uncomfortable question. How does something that powerful fall so quickly? Because empires don't just lose battles. They lose structure, internal strain, overextension, leadership transitions, pressure from multiple directions at once. And when all of that aligns, collapse doesn't take centuries. It takes moments. Persia falls, Greece rises. And then, not long after, Rome takes over. And just like that, the world's focus shifts. New empires, new systems, new dominance. And Persia? It disappears from the center of the story. At least, that's what it looks like. But this is where the deeper pattern begins to reveal itself. Because disappearance is not always absence. Sometimes, it's repositioning. While Greece and Rome dominate visibly, shaping culture, military power, and global expansion, Persia doesn't vanish. It remains. Geographically, culturally, structurally, and more importantly, strategically. Because power doesn't always need to be visible to be present. Some influence operates quietly, not leading the stage, but never leaving it. And this is where the pattern starts to look familiar. Because we've seen this before. A power rises at the right time, plays a critical role, then steps back when global attention shifts. Not destroyed, not erased, just less visible, which is very different. Because when something is removed completely, it cannot return. But when something steps back, it can. And that's exactly what makes this moment important. Because Persia's story does not end here. It pauses. And during that pause, the world changes. Empires rise and fall, new systems take over, new conflicts emerge.
But the region Persia once influenced never becomes irrelevant. It remains active, contested, strategically important. And that means something else remains too. Access, position, awareness. Because any power that once understood the structure of that region does not lose that understanding overnight. And this is where the connection to the present becomes sharper. Because modern power is no longer just about who dominates visibly. It's about who understands the system, who stays positioned, who remains embedded, even when they are not leading. So when you look at today's global structure, you start to notice something. Not every influential player is always at the center. Some are quiet, present, active, but not always in focus. And that is exactly how Persia behaves after its fall. It steps out of the spotlight, but not out of the system. Which leads to a question most people never ask. If a power once shaped the foundation of a region and never fully left that region, then is it truly gone? Or is it simply waiting for the moment when it becomes relevant again? Because history doesn't always move in straight lines. Sometimes it circles back. And when it does, the powers that seemed forgotten are already in position.
After centuries of silence, Persia appears again. Not as an empire, not as a military force, but as something far more subtle. Awareness. Because while Rome controlled the world and Jerusalem held religious authority, neither of them recognized what was happening. But Persia did. And it didn't happen through power. It happened through knowledge. The men who arrived in Jerusalem that night were not random travelers. They were magi, observers of patterns, students of the skies, keepers of ancient records. And most importantly, they were not starting from scratch. Because long before this moment, a man had lived inside the system of Babylon and Persia. Daniel, a captive who became an advisor, a foreigner who gained access to the highest levels of power. But more than that, he carried something Persia did not originally have: prophetic knowledge, visions, timelines, interpretations that went beyond politics and into something structured, something measurable. And when Daniel served in those courts, that knowledge didn't disappear after him. It stayed, recorded, studied, passed down. Which means by the time the Magi appear, they are not guessing. They are recognizing. Because while others saw a star, they saw a signal. Not just astronomical, but aligned with something already known. A pattern connecting sky movement to written prophecy. And that is why they moved with certainty. They didn't wait for confirmation. They didn't debate what it meant. They traveled across distance, across political territories, into a region controlled by another empire. That kind of movement only happens when the information is trusted. And this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Because Jerusalem, the center of religious knowledge, missed it. Rome, the center of global power, ignored it. But Persia, the power that had stepped out of visibility, recognized it, which reveals something deeper. Influence does not always come from control. Sometimes it comes from understanding. Persia was no longer leading the world, but it was still reading it correctly. And that changes how you interpret everything that comes next. Because if a system once built around observation, records, and long-term patterns can recognize something before dominant powers do, then its relevance never truly disappeared. It just shifted form. And the question becomes even more serious now. If Persia once recognized what others missed, what patterns might it be recognizing today that others are still ignoring? Now we move out of ancient history and into something far less comfortable. Because when people talk about modern Iran, they often describe it as isolated, sanctioned, restricted, separated from global systems. But that description only tells part of the story, because isolation on the surface does not always mean disconnection beneath it. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Iran is not absent from the region. It is present in multiple layers, not always directly, not always visibly, but consistently, across borders, across alliances, across influence channels that don't always make headlines in obvious ways. This is not unusual in modern power structures, because influence today is rarely about direct control. It's about positioning, being present in key locations, maintaining relationships that extend beyond official narratives, operating in ways that don't require constant visibility to remain effective. And when you map that out carefully, you begin to notice something. Iran's presence is not random. It is structured. Certain regions matter more than others. Certain connections are maintained over long periods of time. Certain responses are calculated, not impulsive. Even when tensions rise, the moves are rarely without context. They follow patterns. Patterns shaped by geography, by history, by long-standing rivalries and alliances that didn't start in this generation. And this is where most people misread the situation, because they focus only on what is happening now. A conflict, a response, a headline. But they miss what led to it, the positioning that existed before the moment, the relationships that were already in place, the influence that was built quietly, long before it became visible. Which brings us back to something we've already seen. Persia did not rise randomly. It was positioned before it appeared. And that same idea applies here. Modern Iran is not reacting in isolation. It is operating from within a network of connections that have developed over time. Some obvious, some less visible, but all contributing to a larger structure. And this is where the conversation becomes more serious. Because when actions are misunderstood as random, people miscalculate. But when actions are recognized as part of a pattern, the entire situation looks different. Not simpler, but clearer. And that clarity matters. Because if a nation is deeply embedded within a region, then what happens next is rarely sudden. It is usually the result of something that has been building quietly. Which leads to a question most people are starting to ask now. Are we watching isolated events unfold? Or are we watching a structure that has been forming begin to reveal itself? If you only look at headlines, everything feels sudden. A meeting here, a statement there, a rising tension that seems to appear overnight. But when you step back and observe carefully, a different picture begins to form. Because alliances don't start when they are announced. They start long before that, quietly, through conversations that are not public, through shared interests that don't need to be declared, through small, repeated interactions that slowly build alignment over time. And this is where the current landscape becomes impossible to ignore.
because certain relationships in the region should not make sense at first glance. Historical rivals, now showing signs of coordination. Groups that once operated independently, now moving in ways that appear connected. Not identical, not perfectly synchronized, but aligned just enough to suggest something deeper. And this is not about speculation. It's about patterns. Because when separate actors begin to respond in similar ways to similar events, over and over again, that is no longer coincidence. It is structure. And structure takes time to build. No alliance forms in a moment of crisis. It is prepared before the crisis, tested in smaller situations, strengthened through shared outcomes, refined through trial and response, so that when pressure increases, the response is not confusion, it is coordination. And this is exactly what we are beginning to see. Not perfectly, not completely, but clearly enough to raise a question. How long has this been forming? Because if you trace back far enough, you begin to notice that some of these connections did not appear recently. They evolved, gradually, across years, sometimes decades. Which means what looks like sudden alignment today may actually be the visible phase of something that has been developing quietly for a long time. And this is where the deeper implication comes in. Because when alliances reach the point where they no longer need explanation, it means they have already stabilized internally. They no longer depend on public approval. They operate based on shared understanding. And that makes them harder to detect early, but more effective when they become visible. Which brings us back to a familiar pattern: positioning. Just like Persia didn't move until the moment was right, modern alignments don't reveal themselves until they are ready. And once they do, it's usually because they have already been tested, already been built, already been understood by the people involved. So the real question is not whether alliances are forming. That part is already visible. The real question is this: how far along are they? Because the stage where things become visible is rarely the stage where they begin. It's the stage where they are almost ready.
When people hear about prophecy, they usually focus on the outcome: a war, a conflict, a dramatic final moment. But Ezekiel 38 doesn't start with a battle. It starts with a formation. And that's the part most people skip. Because the prophecy does something very specific. It lists names, not symbols, not vague descriptions, names. And among those names, Persia appears clearly, not hidden, not interpreted, stated. Which means long before modern borders, long before current headlines, this region was already placed inside a future alignment. But the prophecy doesn't stop at naming Persia. It describes a structure, a coalition, multiple regions moving together, not identical in nature, not necessarily equal in power, but connected. And that detail matters more than most people realize. Because wars can happen suddenly, but coalitions take time. They require shared interests, shared direction, and a level of coordination that doesn't appear overnight. And when you read Ezekiel 38 carefully, it doesn't describe chaos. It describes organization. A group that rises together, moves together, acts with a level of unity that suggests preparation. And this is where the connection to the present becomes unavoidable. Because today, we are not just seeing isolated tensions, we are seeing relationships, shifting alignments, cooperation in certain areas, patterns of response that, while not identical,
are increasingly connected. Now this is important. This is not about forcing a conclusion. It's about recognizing structure. Because the prophecy doesn't say when everything happens. It doesn't give a fixed timeline. But it does describe how things come together. And that how is what matters. Because if you remove the dramatic ending, what you are left with is a process. Formation first, movement later. And that is exactly how real-world systems operate. No major alignment appears fully formed. It builds quietly, through shared pressure points, through repeated interactions, through gradual shifts that only become obvious when you step back. So when people read Ezekiel 38 as just a future battle, they miss the more important question. Not when will this happen, but are the pieces already forming? Because once a formation begins, the outcome is no longer the first stage. It's the final one. And by the time something reaches its final stage, it has already been in motion for longer than most people realize. Which means the most important part to watch is not the explosion. It's the alignment before it. This is the point where most people go too far, or not far enough. They either assume everything is happening exactly as written, or they dismiss everything as unrelated. But the truth usually sits somewhere in between. Because when you compare what is described with what is happening, you begin to notice similarities. Not perfect matches, not exact replicas, but patterns. Regional tension that doesn't resolve easily. Multiple actors becoming increasingly connected. Pressure building around the same geographic space, again and again. And then there's something else. Timing. Not exact dates, but sequences. Events that don't stand alone, but follow each other in ways that suggest movement, not randomness. And this is where it becomes difficult to ignore. Because when patterns repeat across different moments with different players, but similar structure, it forces a question. Is this coincidence, or is this progression? But at the same time, there are differences, and those differences matter. Because not every alignment is complete. Not every relationship is fully stable. Not every tension has reached its peak. Some connections are still forming. Some responses are still inconsistent. Some outcomes remain uncertain. Which means we are not looking at a finished picture. We are looking at something in development. And that changes how it should be interpreted. Because recognizing a pattern is not the same as confirming an outcome. And this is where most people get it wrong. They rush. They take partial information and turn it into a final conclusion. But complex systems don't work that way. They unfold, gradually, layer by layer. Which means the most important skill here is not prediction. It's recognition. Seeing what is forming without forcing what it means too early. Because once you force a conclusion, you stop observing. And when you stop observing, you miss what comes next. So, instead of asking, is this exactly what was described? A better question is, what parts of this look familiar, and what parts are still missing? Because that question keeps you aware, balanced, focused, not pulled into fear, and not lost in dismissal. And that is where clarity begins. Not in certainty, but in careful observation. Because if something is forming, you will see it more clearly over time. And if it isn't, the pattern will break.
Either way, the answer reveals itself, but only to those who are paying attention. There is a part of this story almost no one talks about, not because it's unclear, but because it doesn't fit into a simple narrative. Jeremiah 49, a prophecy directed at Elam, an ancient region located in what is now southwestern Iran. And what makes this prophecy different is not just what it says, it's how it says it. Because most people expect prophecy to move in one direction, judgment or restoration. But this one does both. First, it speaks of disruption, strength broken, stability shaken, a nation losing its ability to stand the way it once did. Not instantly, but decisively. The kind of shift that doesn't always happen in one moment, but unfolds across time. Through pressure, through conflict, through internal and external forces that slowly change a nation's position. And when you look at history, and even current developments, that pattern is not unfamiliar. No region maintains strength without challenge. No system remains stable forever. And the prophecy acknowledges that reality. But it doesn't stop there. Because after the disruption, it says something unexpected. Restoration. Not immediate, not clearly defined in timing, but stated. A return, a rebuilding, a future that is not entirely defined by collapse. And this is where the deeper insight begins. Because this breaks the way most people think about nations. They assume a single direction. Rise, then fall. Strength, then weakness. But this introduces something more complex. Cycles. Transformation instead of finality. And when you apply that to what we see today, the interpretation becomes more careful. Because it suggests that no current state is permanent. Not dominance, not instability, not tension. Everything is part of a longer movement. Which means when people try to reduce Iran's future to one outcome, they miss the full picture. Because the framework itself is not one-dimensional. It allows for pressure and change and re-emergence. And that changes how you look at everything that's unfolding. Because instead of asking, what will happen to Iran? A better question becomes, what stage are we looking at right now? Because if disruption and restoration are both part of the structure, then what we see today is not the final version. It's a phase. And phases don't last forever. They evolve. Which means the most important thing is not reacting to what is visible now, but understanding that what comes next may not look the way people expect. And that possibility is what makes this prophecy so easy to overlook and so important to understand. At this point, the most important thing is not prediction, it's interpretation. Because once you've seen the patterns, the alignments, the historical cycles, the question is no longer what will happen next. It becomes, what should we be watching? Because escalation rarely begins with a single event. It builds, step by step, response by response, pressure meeting pressure, until something shifts. And when you look at the region today, you can already see those layers forming. Tensions that don't fully resolve. Situations that calm down but never completely disappear. Moments that feel contained but leave something behind. That's not randomness. That's accumulation. And accumulation is what eventually leads to escalation. Not always immediately, not always dramatically, but consistently. which means the trajectory is not about one headline. It's about direction. Are things stabilizing, or are they becoming more interconnected and reactive over time? Because when multiple actors are involved, escalation doesn't require everyone to move at once. It only requires enough pressure points to align. And this is where careful observation becomes critical. Not reacting to every development, but noticing patterns across them. Repeated tensions in the same locations. Similar responses from different actors. Shifts in positioning that suggest preparation, not reaction. These are the signals that matter. Not because they confirm an outcome, but because they reveal movement. And movement is always easier to understand early than after it accelerates. So instead of focusing on dramatic scenarios, a more grounded approach is this. Watch consistency. Watch how often certain patterns repeat. Watch which relationships strengthen over time. Watch where pressure continues to build without resolution. Because those are the indicators of direction. Not certainty, direction. And that distinction matters. Because certainty creates fear, but understanding creates clarity. And clarity allows you to stay aware without being pulled into conclusions too early. Because history has already shown something important. Major shifts don't surprise those who are paying attention. They only surprise those who were looking in the wrong place. So moving forward, the goal is not to predict the exact moment something happens. It's to recognize when something is forming. Because once you can see that clearly, you are no longer reacting to events. You are understanding them. And that changes everything. When you step back and look at everything together, a pattern begins to emerge. Not perfectly clear, not fully complete, but consistent enough to recognize. An empire that didn't rise by accident. A decision that reshaped a region for generations. A disappearance that wasn't truly absence. A return that happened through awareness, not power. A modern presence that is more connected than it appears. Alliances forming quietly before becoming visible. A prophecy describing structure, not just outcome. And a timeline that doesn't rush, but unfolds. None of these elements on their own seem definitive, but together, they start to form something. And this is where most people feel the tension, because the human instinct is to conclude, to take everything we've seen and turn it into a fixed answer. But this story doesn't move that way. It doesn't force a conclusion. It invites observation. Because what we're looking at is not a single event. It's a process, one that stretches across history, moves through the present, and continues forward without announcing exactly where it ends. And that's what makes it difficult to ignore. Because the same region that was positioned in the past remains central today. The same patterns of alignment are still forming. The same questions about timing are still being asked. And the same uncertainty about what comes next is still present. Which means this isn't just about what has happened, it's about what is still unfolding. So instead of asking for certainty, the more important question is this: are we watching history repeat? Or are we watching something slowly take shape? Because those are not the same thing. Repetition follows a known path, but something taking shape is still in motion, still developing, still incomplete. And that means what we're seeing now may not be the final picture, just the early outline. And the way you respond to that matters. Because if you assume everything is already decided, you stop paying attention. But if you recognize that things are still forming, you stay aware. You notice more. You understand more. And when the next shift happens, it won't feel sudden. It will feel familiar, because you've been watching it build. And that may be the most important part of all. Not knowing exactly what comes next, but being able to recognize it when it does.